Bonjour, good morning. My name is Yumna. I come from Aix-en-Provence in France. And I'm very happy to be here today and introduce our second panel. But before doing that, I would love to thank the conveners of this conference, Idisha, Judith, and Thomas. Un grand merci. Thanks so very much. A big thank you goes to the organizing committee. And of course, it cannot go without thanking you for being here. Otherwise, we won't have a panel. Today's panel is entitled Body Repatriation and Families. It includes 3 talks that will take us to different places and talk about different families. We will start talking about migrants and families of migrants living in France and Finland. Then we go to talk about Tunisian families of missing migrants, and we will end with Mexican families. We will start with our first speaker, Linda Haapajärvi, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Research on Ethnic Relation and Nationalism at the University of Helsinki. She's currently working on death immigration, in particular on the phenomenon of the post-mortem repatriation that she approaches from the perspective of relational economic sociology. Her talk is entitled Monies, Bodies and Belonging, Transnational Family Dynamics from the Perspective of Post-mortem Repatriation Arrangements. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Linda.
Okay, I first want to thank you as well, Yumna, for the presentations and the organizers of this conference, Fanatic Ethics Theme, for the occasion to present my work. I'm looking at the time, so I'm not trying to keep a track of that. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's actually the first in-person conference I'm attending since the pandemic broke out, and the very first time that I'm presenting this strand of my research. So here's the first times. And in preparing for this conference, I was actually listening to the previous webinars and conference panels online in the on the Fanatic Ethics YouTube channel. I'm not paid for this advertisement. It's a wonderful resource. And I was kind of thinking about, so how can I make my own presentation today complementary to all the wealth of knowledge that is already there, as we are working on similar themes. They're very inspiring and resonate with the concerns that I'm raising. So I'm looking at, as Yumna said, economic arrangements that make body repatriation possible in the context of migration between Europe and Africa, or to put it in other words, the ethos of return that governs the economic and social practices of individuals in both migrant sending and receiving sites. Ethos here understood as what is valued as good in a way of life and death, as a practical orientation to the material world, to others, to oneself, as a kind of a moral code that signifies the ways one imagines the future and engages with it. Here, the inescapable horizon of death in migration. I mobilized today 2 cases that I have recorded over time, as I was involved in research looking at quite other things: migrant evangelical Christian communities in Paris and Helsinki, and immigrant integration policies. And as I became close with these migrant individuals who themselves were confronted with the issue of death. So my research is quite different from, to name a few examples, from this particular forum of Yumna's work on Algerians in Marseille, or Juliet's works on Tajikin Russians, or Felician's work on the Senegalese in Belgium and Spain, in that it does not focus on a single group in a given context, but is more open to a variety of groups, patterns, and contexts of migration, and the limits and advantages of which we can actually discuss in the discussion part, if you like. Now, with these premises in mind, I want to share with you 2 empirical cases from my ongoing research and discuss the notion of transnational death money that I developed to examine patterns of postmortem mobility and, more broadly, the dynamics of transnational belonging in a world where access to cross-border movement remains unequal. And as I was preparing trying to prepare a complementary presentation to what is already out there. The title of the presentation already also changed from what I had handed in the beginning of the year. So we're looking at a presentation entitled Fixing the Final Journey, Varieties of Transnational Death Money and Belonging. So I'll start with the very first, my first encounter with the matter of death in migration with, Uba's jar. Uba, a Somali woman in her 50s, had invited me over for tea at her place following the soup cafe activity organized for migrant women at the Kampila Community Center, a public institution in a disadvantaged neighborhood of Helsinki, putting in practice participatory integration policies. This was in 2014. Each week, a woman would prepare a lunch in the institution's kitchen and then sell it to other women attending the activity with their offspring. The soup cafe gathered women together in this poor urban neighborhood to eat, to mind their children, and perhaps to spark off interpersonal engagements and sentiments of place attachment. Uba, my interlocutor, first arrived in Finland as a refugee from the civil war-torn Somalia in the 1990s with her husband and their 5 children. 2 daughters would later be born in Helsinki. Now estranged from her husband, she lives in Kampila with her 2 youngest daughters. 2 of her older children have moved on to London and 3 have established their own families in Helsinki. Uba had only occasionally attended a madrasa, a religious school in Somalia, and had learned to read and write, speak Finnish, some very rudimentary English in Finland, and now works intermittently in short contracts in the childcare sector in Helsinki. So it's important for Uba to cook food at this community center and to sell it to the other attendants, other targets of immigrant integration policies, because it allows for her to make some extra money to the tight family budget. She's very proud of making that money that she has used to support her mother, who stayed behind in Somalia and who passed away in 2012. Since her mother's passing and with only 2 high school attending daughters at home, the money Uba makes as she cooks at the community center has now taken on a new purpose. Today we met at her place. Uba held the 42 euros she had made today in one hand and reaching for a jar stocked on the upper shelves of her kitchen with the other. She opened the jar and placed a 20 euro banknote in it. Winking an eye on me, she's a very humoristic, funny person, she exclaimed, "My death money," and placed the jar back on the upper shelf of her kitchen. When she was seated by the table again, I asked Uba the money. "Well, that's my ticket back home, if my children care to take me there, inshallah." To Uba, home is in her village in rural Somalia, not far from Mogadishu. She nods at the jar and then reiterates, "See, that's my ticket back home. I'm going to be buried at home." I ask her whether that's because of cultural and religious customs related to burial. "Well, sure, I'd like to be buried with no delay in a shroud, but I want to be buried by my mother's side. You know, I never asked to come here," she says about Finland. Well, we here find motives for body repatriation that others before me have underscored, even in this forum. Uba alludes to the fact that she came to Finland not by choice, but by force as a humanitarian refugee fleeing the civil war. So the post-mortem return appears as a way of reconciliating with the past, of reviving the tie to the kin and to the land that were torn by the armed conflict. Uba describes as particularly painful the experience of having left her elderly mother behind in the village in the midst of the conflict. She is also very attached to the centrality of Somalia, appears also as important as her family has been spread all over the globe. Uba and her children are in Helsinki. She has extended family in London, as many Somalis set in Finland do. Her husband has also moved there. Her youngest daughters harbor the dream of moving to Australia, where they have cousins. So in this complex diasporic constellation, the Somali village of origin stands as a kind of morally invested pivotal point of a connection to which the connection to which needs to be cherished, and the body repatriation appears as one of the ways to do this. But Uba faces 3 elements of uncertainty with regard to body repatriation. Money. UBA estimates the cost of the transportation of bodily remains to Somalia at somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 euros. And she's not quite sure if with her jar she will ever make it, but she says, at least I'll be able to take on my account some of the cost. Feasibility. A second problem concerns the situation in Somalia. It's an unstable zone with a failed state. So UBA herself is rather doubtful about the feasibility of body repatriation, which is not a very common practice in Somalis settled in Finland for this particular reason. And the third factor, trust. Will my children do it? She asks. As we go on discussing the matter, the ones in London may be able to throw in some money, but the ones in Helsinki, will they go through with the hassle? Even the embassy of Somalia is set in Sweden. I told them it's important to me to be repatriated, and they say, of course, Mom. They know about my jar, but will they do it when the time comes? She was kind of haunted by this uncertainty. And then I asked her, and what if not? Well, then I guess I'll end up at the cemetery in Helsinki with a stone and lanterns. You can come and visit me. You can bring flowers. Uba chuckles and then grows serious again. I don't mind, but really, I don't need a tombstone, flowers and all that. I just want to be buried there by my mother in Somalia. So that was my first encounter with the issue of body repatriation and actually of the economic arrangements that may allow the practice. There were two things that moved and puzzled me. To a certain extent, her practice, Uba's practice, resonated with Philip Arias's 1975 thesis on death in Western societies of the modern era. Death and burial are foundational to human communities and cultures. The burial place marks individual and civilizational origins. Yet, according to Arias, the modernization process is characterized with increased levels of mobility that cuts individuals loose of their traditional coordinates of belonging. The modern being is thus haunted by not knowing where she will be buried and hence where she belongs, who she is. So this element of ontological insecurity can also be found among migrants, as Uba's case and many others show. The experience of migration, for sure, rattles traditional social, moral, and spatial orders and coordinates. But there is also, I find, something qualitatively different in the case of migrants like Uba, who aspire for body repatriation. They are not so much, perhaps, haunted by the question of where they shall be buried, where they belong, but by the means of making that happen. They know they want to be buried what they understand as home, but they are uncertain of whether that is possible. They need to tame the risk of being buried in the wrong place should they not be able to return home alive, which Uba would actually prefer. And the other thing that puzzled me was that the practice of saving money to secure body repatriation, which may mean bearing deprivation and thrift when living, striked as counter evidence to the argument on the rational underpinnings of classical theorization of migration as motivated by the perspective of economic gains and migrants as individual profit maximizers. Spending great sums in body repatriation just doesn't fit the scheme of individualistic economic rationality. So my way of starting to unravel the puzzle has consisted on concentrating on the money in the jar, really. What is that money and what does it do? What is it capable of doing? What kind of work does it do? I have followed relational economic sociologists and most notably Viviana Zelizer, and have started to conceptualize the money in the jar as special money, as transnational death money, money designated to cover expenses of cross-border transfer of mortal remains. It's money migrants set apart from other kind of currencies, money to pay the rent, to send home as remittances and so forth, money they earmark for the particular use of body repatriation. And this earmarking is particularly obvious in Uba's case, as she physically sets apart her death money in a jar that itself is hidden in her kitchen, with only her two youngest daughters knowing about the existence and the purpose of the container. However, as any special money, transnational death money does more than get bodies in zinc caskets, plain, and into the ancestral humus, right? It has deep social, relational, and emotional dimensions that shape the relations between its different handlers, the people who come in contact with this money. Drawing from the notion of relational work, I explore the combinations of 4 elements that Viviana Zelizer mentions: interpersonal ties, transactions, media of exchange, and negotiated meanings that transnational death money comprises of. And I'd like to add the element of, 5th element of emotions on the list of what constitutes relational packages. As transnational death money is rife with affects ranging from uncertainty and hope, uncertainty and fear, to hope, serenity, and even redemption. I argue that following this analytical scheme, we can better understand the ways economic and social practices are not separable but deeply intertwined, and how they together sustain belonging in the context of transnational migration. Let's recapitulate on UBA's jar, which as a financial instrument of foreseeing, as a technology of foreseeing, is a very rudimentary one, right? It's informal personal savings in cash deposited in one's kitchen. So let's consider quickly the 4 elements to illustrate what I mean by transnational death money and the relational work it allows to its handlers to perform. So what distinctive interpersonal ties? Who does this money connect UBA to? Well, this particular practice of foresight is very individualized, as UBA is the only person who actually deposits money in that jar, right? But it has a kind of like extended notion in the sense that she has put her intimate close kin in the know about the monies or the container's existence, the 2 daughters who still live with her at home. UBA relies on this. So what this basically tells us that in the Helsinki context in 2013, UBA cannot rely on the kinds of community funds, mutual aid funds that have been rightfully researched so far by scholars working on this area. They do not exist. There are not mutual aid funds assuring body repatriation to Somalia from Finland. Hence, UBA depends on intimate kinship bonds and for this practice, and the practice appears as particularly precarious. The money, the relational work, or the kind of economic transactions that take place are so the deposits of the kind of media, cash in that banknotes and coins in that particular jar. And what are then the kind of meanings, deep meanings the money carries that we can see when we're looking at the jar and thinking about it, talking about it with UBA, the practices around it. We are looking at home country allegiance, intergenerational obligation. She wants to return to her mother and she has to put her daughters in the know in order to achieve that. And the jar can also be a kind of symbol of Finland, of the division between Finland as a temporary and ambivalent location, and Somalia as the final good focal point of their moral geography, to follow Thomas Lacroix's terminology, to which she wants to return. And the kind of emotions that we can find here are the longing for the homeland, uncertainty and doubt about the feasibility, and projected sentiments of reconciliation. As I was looking, so this was the first case that I encountered and that I started to conceptualize way back now. I have very little time, but another case that I came across, and this is again from Finland, which is an interesting setting because it's a new destination country. It's outside of European like main migrant receiving settings such as France, the UK, with colonial connections, hence easy travel, for instance. And because migration to Finland does not often follow chain migration patterns, so also the economic arrangements the immigrants have put in place to foresee body repatriation are very different and oftentimes much more precarious than the ones that we can find in places like France. So I think I have about 2 minutes. So Prince was 3. Okay, excellent. I first met Prince in 2009 as I was doing a research project on evangelical Christian churches implanted in Europe by migrants from Africa. Prince went to the Hosanna Chapel in Helsinki, that is pictured here. The 3 men in the front row are acting as the pastors of the community, and you see a tall male figure at the back, and that's actually our protagonist. Prince. And we are here looking at the Thanksgiving service in September in 2013, where the members of the church give special offerings to a small basket placed in front of the altar to give thanks to God for the various blessings that they have faced this particular year. Prince actually came back. So here we are in September, and Prince came back from Nigeria, from a 3-month trip to Nigeria in August 2013, during which he had buried his father, who had unexpectedly died. So to make the travel, first of all, to buy plane tickets, to buy gifts to take home, to assure the financial cost of the funeral organization, Prince could call upon the church's welfare funds that start to maybe will evolve into something like a mutual aid fund in the future. But I'm going to speed up. As he came back from Nigeria, he actually realized that he himself would like to be buried there later, although he was about to marry a Finnish woman and start a family in Helsinki. But he came from a lineage of chiefs. So for now, he abdicated his responsibilities as the son to a local chief in the Edo state of Nigeria, and decided that I will lead my earthly life here in Helsinki, but I will go back to Nigeria to be buried. And what I found interesting about this second case, that we are faced different kinds of transnational death money, not the kind of personal savings in informal personal savings that very loosely link migrants to others, markets, states, other organizations, and that actually allude also to a precarious attempt at body repatriation. Here we're looking at 2 other types. The church welfare fund that somehow resembles mutual aid funds, the kind of caisse communautaire, caisse de village that we have learned about in previously, but here it's organized by the migrant religious community set in Helsinki. And then the other tool that we can look at, Prince, when he came back to Helsinki in autumn 2013, started to make inquiries for subscribing to an repatriation insurance policy, which is basically an individual financial asset, right? This proved to be very difficult because Finland, as a peripheral country to global migration flows, does not have a market like France and the UK around, has not have seen an evolution of a market around or the emergence of a market around body repatriation and burial of migrants. So Prince ended up subscribing to an insurance scheme from an operator based in London. And I have here outlined on the slide the different elements that the different kinds of relational work that these types of transnational death money allow to perform. The interesting thing, I think, about the repatriation insurance policy being that if you look at the element number E, the emotional experience, the emotions articulated around this financial tool are that of security. Prince now knows that it's pretty sure that he will make it to Nigeria. He feels relieved. At the same time, there is this deep sense of betrayal towards the wife and children to be born in Finland, because he's even asking whether he can tell them that he has one of these contracts or not. So 10 seconds. Why examine varieties of transnational death monies? In order to form a fuller understanding of the economic arrangements that make body repatriation possible, to understand how the ethos of return, or what other scholars have called thanatic ethics, governs economic and social practices in sending, transit, and receiving sites, find out how different monies tie migrants to other individuals, organizations, markets, and states, and tap into contextual and temporal variation. I've alluded to why Finland as a peripheral setting is quite interesting. Temporal variation, I'm thinking about, for instance, the ongoing process of financialization, how practices like repatriation of bodies are being incorporated in an overarching logic of market economies, and to analyze the determinants of unequal access to post-mortem mobility and mobility more generally between the global and global south and north.
Thank you.
Yes. Everything.
Okay, while they are installing the second PowerPoint, I would love to introduce our second speaker, Sofia Stimmatini, who is a PhD student and a teaching assistant at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. Her doctoral research investigates how families reorganize themselves at the intimate, social, and political levels in the face of the absence caused by the disappearance of migrants. And it also tries to understand how this family reorganization affects the search of the disappeared. Her presentation is entitled Missing Migrants, Political Absence in Tunisia. Please.
Good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank the project conveners and organization committee for organizing this conference. Thank you to give me the possibility to share the results of my master's thesis. It is the first time that I participate in this kind of events. I'm a little bit nervous. So, in this communication, as Yumna said, I'd like to address the question of disappearances of migration, well, in French is part, in English, there is maybe some question about translations. I use by migration in Tunisia from the point of view of people who remain in the departure country. So this phenomenon is produced by the European violent migration policies and occurs when people around the migrants who left do not know their fate. They do not have access to some news nor to their bodies. They cannot produce documents that certify the death if these people are dead. And so they cannot do funerary rituals. Families are immersed in a rituality, as Valérie Loiseau calls the privation of ritual. Like death, the disappearance is a total social fact which affects all spheres of life, private and public of those who remain in the departure country. Nevertheless, in the case of disappearances, the families believes that migrants could still be alive because of the lack of information. Till the relatives do not receive the death confirmation, from their point of view, these people are not dead. They are in an ontological limbo between the living and the dead. They are perceived by the families as temporarily absent. They are liminal beings. So the families are immersed in a situation of unknown place and time, unknown destiny, unknown death or life. So this communication is based on fieldwork in Tunisia among relatives of missing migrants. I did the research during my master's in anthropology in 2018 and 19, and I chose a family-led approach. Relatives of the disappeared don't live grief, but an uncertain absence that Pauline Boss calls ambiguous loss. In Tunisia, the political atmosphere allowed families to transform the sorrow of the loss, of this ambiguous loss, into conflictual public claims for knowing the truth about the fate of the missing. So today I would like to discuss here how the unknown hurts the families of the disappeared and in Tunisia. So first I'm going to explain the context of the disappearances of migration in Tunisia and the rise of the protests. Then I'm going to analyze the conflicts caused by the situation of the unknown. And finally, I will show in which sense these political actions challenge the unrituality. But above all, as a lot of scholars pointed out, I would like to specify that in the Mediterranean context, it is difficult to have precise data about border deaths and disappearances. In fact, official authorities in the departure country do not compile, obviously, a register of the so-called regular migrations, regular departures, nor the disappearances. Then, given the lack of official devices and protocols for counting deaths and disappearances at the European level, data is produced crossing resources from university, from non-governmental organization, but also from official authorities like Frontex. Moreover, if a body is found on the coast of Europe, it is often buried without taking data useful for identification purposes. And after a shipwreck, bodies are almost always not retrieved and stay in the Mediterranean. So traceability of information is challenging because authorities of different states do not collaborate. In this panorama, the role of families who denounce the disappearances is decisive. So I'm passing, but here I wrote off. Well, I am a little bit confused about disappearance of by, I don't know in English what sounds better. Tunisia is a traditional departure country that has been involved in the border externalization since 2004. When Ben Ali's government passed the law 2004 and 6. This law criminalizes would-be migrants by providing 3 years imprisonment and a fine of several thousand dinars for any individual involved in the so-called irregular migration. Before 2011, this law was a good deterrent that reduced the departures. However, in 2011, after the protests of the winter of 2010 and 11, that brought down the Ben Ali regime, thousands of young men decided to reach Italy by boat without the required documents, the Schengen sea visa. These people who try to reach the Schengen space without documents are called Harragas in Maghreb area. So because of the easing of border controls in 2011, a large influx of Tunisians has poured into Italy. The annual risk analysis of Frontex speaks of 28,000 and 829 detections of illegal border of Tunisians. The FITDS, the Tunisian Forum for Economic and Social Rights, speaks instead of 40,000 at least Harragas that left that year. So while most of these young people managed to reach the territory of the Schengen area and warned their families, hundreds of them just disappeared. Have they arrived in Europe and are still stuck in the hotspot? Did criminal organizations kidnap them? Did they drown at sea? Most families claim that their phones were still ringing after a month after departure. If they had drowned, the phones could not ring. This shows well that while the dead body has the capacity to generate feelings and practices associated with the deceased, the absent body produces confusion and disorder that are constantly renewed as relatives can only be relieved if the bodies, alive or dead, are found. Well, in Tunisia, the novelty of 2011 was that the relatives of missing migrants, especially mothers and wives, spontaneously started to demonstrate in front of the embassy of Italy and in front of the Foreign or Social Affairs Ministry. Families wanted to know the truth about the fate of their children or spouses. They asked the governments of Tunisia and Italy that the signs of identification used to monitor the border be used to trace their relatives. But Tunisian and Italian governments have not given answers, nor have facilitated the research. Hence, in the following years, some relatives of the disappeared also decided to create some associations. And this to better claim the right to know the fate of the missing. Halima created the Ardepte, Association for the Search for the Disappeared and Tunisia Prisoners Abroad, in 2011. But Halima started to work on disappearances by migration in 2013. In the same year, Ahmed founded the Association La Terre pour Tous. Munira created Al-Masir, Legend de la Méditerranée. And Fatma, in 2016, created the Mère des Disparus, Mother of the Disappeared. Whose president is Fatma. Most of the families of the disappeared are from the lowest socioeconomic categories and don't speak French or other languages, and they don't live in Tunis. So often cannot afford to travel. Thanks to the president of the associations, and especially Ahmed and Halima, they were represented. However, at the beginning of the protests, so in 2011, the first year after 2011, families were very reluctant to give in to having the presidents carry their demands. They wanted to claim the right to know the fate of their relatives personally. As time passed, in conjunction with the increased politicization of the question of the dead and missing at sea in Europe, the issue of the disappeared Tunisians attracted the attention of different actors. Indeed, networks mobilized for freedom of movement, but also the International Organization for Migration started to take an interest in the absent bodies of missing Tunisians, soliciting presidents and families. In this context, the presidents, especially Ahmed and Halima, began to be the intermediaries between the Tunisian and international actors and the families. And they became the relatives' spokespersons. Nevertheless, a lot of conflicts between presidents, but not only between presidents, arise about who has more rights to speak for the families. In fact, while Ahmed is the uncle of two young men who disappeared in 2011, Halima is the mother of a man who lived in Iraq and disappeared there after the war in 2003. Munira and Fatma don't want Halima to represent families of the disappeared by migration because they believe that the people who disappeared in Iraq are all terrorists. So they think they have more rights than Halima and Ahmed to represent families because of their motherhood and because their relatives disappeared in the context of the Mediterranean. They discredit each other, often accusing them of asking families for money in exchange for information for the disappeared. On their part, a lot of families accuse the presidents of taking advantage of the cause of the disappeared to obtain visa more quickly or financial advantages or benefits from a particular social recognition, denouncing them of going shopping in Europe. Also, families discredit each other for having received money to stop their activism. Indeed, I have often heard that politicians have bought the families, offering them money in exchange for silence and votes. Despite the conflicts that arise between the presidents and the families, relatives had to give in to the political injunction to be represented. Also because the disappearances continue and other disappeared relatives joined the struggle while others abandoned it. And some mothers or wives established personal contacts with activists. In fact, the presidents and these women, mothers and wives, participate in events, conferences, or sit-ins organized by various actors that have different conceptions of what the absent bodies symbolize. On the one hand, the missing bodies of the disappeared can be mobilized by the activists for the liberty of movement. Through the absent bodies of missing migrants, they want to denounce the murderous European border regime and stress the freedom of circulation. On the other hand, the International Organization for Migration can use them to convince potential immigrants not to leave. During activities financed by the International Organization for Migration, workers highlighted the dangers of the journey, considering above all the interests of the member states of the Schengen area. So these different uses of the symbolic ways of the disappeared show that absent bodies live conflictual political lives, depending on the actors who decide to mobilize them and with which presidents and families decide to collaborate. This causes strong disagreements about who cooperates with whom. Often frictions also stem from the assumption that missing migrants are dead. In fact, Ahmed and some FITDS workers told me several times that missing Arragas are dead. However, these deaths are unspeakable. A lot of families refuse to hear this interpretation and get upset if someone suggests it. Also, Ahmed considers that the governments would close the file if they admitted that missing migrants had died. However, not assuming the death of these people causes a lot of rumors. Some suggest that missing migrants were sold to Italy for organ trafficking, and others report that they were taken to Syria on a bus to fight against ISIS. Some families told me that they must go to the Congress of the USA where, according to them, all the files of missing persons from all over the world are kept. The impossibility of stating with certainty where the disappeared are and what has happened to them exposes the families to the vagaries of the unknown. The rumor reflects well the liminality in which the families and their missing loved ones find themselves. It is important to stress the role of the states in maintaining the unknown. In fact, after more than years, neither the Tunisian government nor the Italian one have ever taken responsibility. For example, Tunisia and Italian authorities called for a commission for inquiry in 2015 that had the mission to find out the fate of the people, but the missing migrants in 2011, but it did not publish any reports. The report, families have never heard anything about the work of this commission. In conclusion, although the participation in the last years was less intense than at the beginning of the protests, relatives of the disappeared continue to occupy the public space. The condition of ambiguous loss and unrituality has become a driving force for political action that lasts over time. Some families have participated in all the sit-ins organized to claim the right to know the truth about the missing. Since 2011, these sit-ins have followed the same script. After arriving at the point of the protest, families show the photos of their missing relatives and scream their sorrow and their anger. During these moments, the tensions are suspended. Families collectively expose their suffering bodies in the public space and make the disappeared visible. They convey a counter-narrative of presence against the narrative of denials of governments that like Federica Sossi and Federico Oliveri argue. Hence, I see these performances as forms of rituals that, thanks to the repetitiveness over years, resituate the disappeared in the Tunisian social world. Missing migrants become political figures, always liminal and conflictual, but recognized by civil society. This social recognition allows families to establish a new political relationship with the disappeared, precisely because of collective and public action. These moments cause a shift from a situation of ambiguous loss to a situation of political absence. And this shift produces a questioning of identities. In fact, thanks to the sit-ins, families have started to perceive themselves as relatives of victims of the violent European border regime. Thank you for your attention.
Our third speaker is Laura Gutiérrez, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of the Pacific in California, US. She completed her PhD at the University of California, San Diego, where she was also a visiting scholar at the Center for US-Mexico Studies. She is currently completing a book manuscript on the history of deportation of Mexican migrants in the 20th century. Laura's presentation is on death and the post-deportation deportation experience in Mexico. Please, Laura.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, almost afternoon. Thank you all for being here, and to the organizers. This is such a wonderful experience for me to learn from people also working on subjects related to migration and death. And thank you, Yumna, for agreeing to serve as our commenter and chair. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why I focus on the 1970s before beginning. The 1970s in Mexico are a really interesting time in which you see that the dominant political party, which ruled for the majority of the 20th century, was beginning to fracture in different ways. On top of that, this is following a long-term guest worker program between the US and Mexico. It lasted for more than 2 decades. It began as an emergency World War II labor program, but people in the US grew accustomed to access to affordable labor. Meanwhile, you see that the Mexican economy also became restructured around this issue of millions of migrants going to the US to work there. So I want to start off with talking a little bit of the experience of one migrant upon his return to Mexico before looking at different aspects of life and death during this period. So in 1976, there was newspaper coverage, scandal in the capital's airport. A bracero went mad. Now, the word bracero was used to refer to workers who were going to the United States, a reference to the word arm, brazo. What happened with this bracero who supposedly went mad? He died shortly after disembarking from the plane that transported him and dozens of other deportees from Texas. His body was then left on display at the entrance to the airport for hours. Initially, officials attributed the death to an injection given to control the effects of drugs he had allegedly taken. However, outcry at the public spectacle of his death led to an investigation and an autopsy, which revealed he had died of a fractured cranium from abuse by police officials and guards tasked with monitoring the group of returning migrants. His death and the violence he experienced represents a larger shift in approaches by Mexican authorities. During this decade, Mexico became increasingly concerned with rising rates of deportation. As I mentioned, that guest worker program had ended in the 1960s. Within just a few years, you see that the rates of migrants detained at the border increased by tenfold. You also see that rapid population growth in the nation preoccupied officials. While Mexican politicians' conscious inaction facilitated outmigration, I examined how deportation preoccupied certain branches of the government, leading to covert strategies to minimize coverage of the return of migrants. Mexican officials attempted to manage deportation in the early 70s by controlling the destinations of migrants in violation of their rights. Their status as deportees in Mexico effectively deprived them of their constitutional right to freedom of movement within the nation. After arrival, they were sent aboard trains, buses, and planes away from the border. And all of these different experiments represent different ways in which we can understand the meanings of life and death after deportation. I explore the binational cooperation between American and Mexican officials in the handling of returned migrants. And I'll talk a little bit about a term that what I explain as domestic deportability, a status in which even after removal from the US, deported migrants in Mexico were viewed as an unwelcome, removable presence in border regions, one that needed to be managed, and they needed to be forcibly transported. So I want to talk about this issue of thinking about the problem of labor in Mexico. Here you see shortly after the end of the program, newspapers were endlessly covering these lines. And here we have unending lines of aspiring braceros, hoping that they would someday get contracts, which didn't often come to be able to work in the United States. So what happened? In the early 1970s, as I mentioned, you saw that these numbers of deportees continued to increase. And I'm going to talk about one particular form of managing these deportees. To prevent them from immediately recrossing, you see that they were transported away from the border, but often away from their home states. And they were often transported to areas deemed in need of labor. I used declassified documents from Mexico's secret police archive to analyze how the country's one-party state and the state-controlled press deployed the death of deported migrants to further deter unauthorized immigration. And at the same time, they critiqued deportees as spoiled, entitled, and unwilling to work. They participated at the same time in similar abuse against deported migrants, such as what we just saw in that story of someone that they tried to claim went mad and they tried to accuse him of taking drugs. So this is also reflective of how the Mexican government valued their labor while removing their rights. So I'm going to talk about this period in 1971, where agents from Mexico's intelligence agency, La Dirección General de Investigaciones Políticas y Sociales, abbreviated as IPS, they began to report on the nightly transit of recently deported men. Up to 150 men per trip would be transported by US Border Patrol officials to the border crossing point in Mexicali, Baja California. You can see the red point and the arrow in the top left corner. Then they were handed to Mexican authorities. From there, they would be bused to the local train station and board trains that transported them from Mexicali to the state of Sinaloa, a journey of over 1,000 kilometers that lasted 32 hours. Each night, a train would depart from Mexicali with several hundred to over 1,000 returnees aboard who had been apprehended that day and had gone through questioning by Mexican authorities to confirm their nationality. So why this route in particular? The city of Mexicali in Baja California is 2 hours away from San Diego, California, and only half an hour away from the El Centro Detention Center, which became one of the largest and most important detention centers in this region. For migrants apprehended while attempting to cross the border in this region, it provided an ideal point to return migrants to Mexico. Mexican officials worked with the Border Patrol to coordinate this arrival. Beyond tracking points of entry, the government controlled the paths of male deportees within Mexico and used their arrival as a tool to manage labor needs within the nation. And again, this is all reflective of abusive practices towards returning migrants by the Mexican state. So they were also taking pictures of this. So here is an image from the US border station in Calexico, where they're about to board the buses. And you see here, they're even labeling who it is that's involved. It says the person with his X on his back is one of the officers of the local office of population. So on June 8th, 1971, 26 migrants were deported sometime during the day. At 8:30 p.m., another group of 78 were sent by bus. A larger group would be arriving later. At 9:30 came the large, regularly scheduled group. This time, 185 men were deported and sent by train. So we see a significant amount of collaboration between these officials. In fact, the report even included the complaint that because of the Border Patrol's tardiness in delivering removed migrants, the train's departure was delayed by 15 minutes. The report also thanked everyone involved. Due to everyone's discretion, local press had not covered these return trips at all. They were meant to be secret, and they were meant to try to assuage any concerns that the Mexican government could not handle its migrants. To prevent men from escaping, members of the judicial and municipal police traveled, and they were armed. The May 9th report described how they carried heavy weapons with which they frightened the braceros. And 3 or 4 of the deportees fled by jumping out of the train windows. Those who wished to disembark had to prove they were from these border regions. And again, here we see that kind of balance of life and death. Their labor was valued, but at the same time, they were forcibly transported literally at gunpoint. When they jumped from windows, they were no longer really a concern. Now, you see all sorts of agents writing reports at stops along the way. By the end of this day, over 21,000 migrants had been deported during this period just through this port of entry. And I want to note this is more than the total number of deportees to Mexico that Immigration and Naturalization Services reported that year. In fact, these men were likely categorized as voluntary departures. This tactic of covert removals reflects the context of immigration enforcement before what you see later of what people term low intensity conflict methods and later militarization of the border. So during this time, you see that Mexican intelligence agents report on all these voluntary deportees and the problems they cause. And I want to show you a couple more pictures. Again, there's a lot of coverage of what these reports are, and they're being sent to Mexico City to document what is going on. So here you see men with their bags and the label on the back, a deported bracero who was deported through Mexicali. So you even see that later on, agents who are working for this office are beginning to explain these different categories of people who are being deported and also talking about the problems they present. An agent known only as MVM described how the official numbers of deportees failed to consider the significantly larger group of migrants. And I also want to mention that, of course, gender matters. These men were viewed as unaccompanied laborers who could work in other areas of the country. Even in their home country, they were migrant workers whose family and community connections did not matter. And I want to talk a little bit about one case of a person who was deported several years later. And again, contrast this with thinking about the meanings of death during this period. In 1976, Cornelio Valderas Gonzalez was deported to the northern city of Matamoros, far from his home state of San Luis Potosí. He spent a day being transported to Mexico's interior on a bus with many other deportees. Shortly after arriving in his hometown, he went to the local government-sponsored clinic, complaining of intestinal pain, vomiting, and headaches, which he said were due to torture he had undergone before being deported. Shortly after 9 p.m. that day, he died in the clinic. And you see here one of the first newspaper articles that covers it, really the day after. A deported bracero died due to blows received in the US. Now, this was just a really short newspaper article, but day after day, you continue to see more and more coverage of this issue. His story was instantly reported, even making it to national newspapers. The outcry at his death, allegedly either by his US employer or officials who deported him, resulted in local authorities declaring they would exhume his body to conduct an autopsy to ascertain the claims of abuse. The autopsy discovered he had died of cardiorespiratory arrest due to a ruptured spleen and a damaged lung, and clear evidence of abuse. His family was involved in these calls for justice. They asked the president to intervene, they asked local officials to intervene, and they called out Mexican officials who they said had not followed proper protocol. The story of his body reflects a national acknowledgement of abuse that migrants underwent in the US and collective frustration with the Mexican state for failing to protect those who went abroad. You see that this politicization of his corpse in many ways ultimately proved fruitless. The head of the Ministry of Foreign Relations said that the agency would issue instructions to all Mexican consulates in the US to prevent further deaths. All of these promises were made, but within days, newspapers began publishing on another case of tortured braceros and asking for justice for those who had been abused in the US. And several months later, you see that another highly publicized case of a deportee once again made national headlines. The same story I began with of a man who that time was killed at the hands of Mexican authorities. So what do these stories of life and death tell us? The Mexican state, fracturing from the inside, could not handle the consequences of ongoing mass emigration during this period. And I want to point out a little bit of the sources that I use are really reflective often of what the president's personal concerns were. The president this time, people argue, was very paranoid in many ways. He was concerned about the political party's reputation in the nation. This was following a highly publicized case of protesters who were massacred during the 1968 Mexico Olympics, shortly before they began. So his goal was sort of trying to recover the reputation of the ruling party, which is why he was so concerned with what local and national press might cover, why he was concerned about this issue of deportees. Now, as later noted by critics, after this whole period of forced migration was ended, this forced movement violated the Mexican Constitution and the freedom to travel within the country. But again, this is a strategic decision by authorities to prevent attempts to recross, to transport migrants to areas thought to be in need of workers, and also to prevent deportees from being used as political tools by political parties opposed to the main ruling party. Now, this process, well, these processes of deportation functioned as ways to manage labor needs within Mexico, indicating how migrants continued to be viewed as temporary, tractable labor sources within their home country. But it also tells us how US deportation practices shaped Mexico's interior and how this collaboration led to an increasingly punitive approach to managing return migration. Forced transportation within the nation must be understood as another aspect of deportation that resettled migrants. And these actions reflect a larger pattern of abuse against deportees that deprives them of their rights. It also reflects ongoing discrimination that paints deportees as outsiders, needing to be controlled and removed from the areas to which they are sent. And I will point out that in recent years, many people have talked about violence and discrimination facing deportees in Mexico. It didn't come from nowhere. You see a much longer history of this. And as I point out in the 1970s, you already had this discrimination existing at that point. But all of these efforts to occlude and manage everyday deportations left migrants in vulnerable positions. You think about work by migration scholars who discuss concepts of estranged citizenship and the term I discuss of domestic deportability. At the same time, you see that there's this conscious desire to try to frame deportation as exceptional moments rather than as an ongoing issue. When you think about inhumane approaches to Latin American migration today, they represent a system predicated on generations of migrant removals and abuse at the hands of authorities, while officials embrace increasingly punitive methods to prevent reentry. What's less covered is how, in attempting to manage return migration, Mexico has also been an active participant in the exploitation of its citizens. Thank you all. And actually, I had one last image too, sorry, that I wanted to point out. This was included in the files too, and this is a Cartolandia, literally like a sort of city built out of cardboard homes or a part of a larger city of Tijuana. This was used by agents to describe the very real risk of allowing deportees to remain in border cities. that you would have these slums cropping up on the outskirts. This would be a shame to Mexico. Again, San Diego is just on the other side, but also a risk to rapidly growing border cities.
Thank you. I will do my best to try to recap some of the main points we discussed in this panel before opening the floor to questions. And I'm very proud that we are on time. We didn't go over time. So it's the impact. I'm going